I know a lot of it has to be rose colored glasses and nostalgia, but I really do miss a lot of things from the 90s, which is when I did most of my growing up. And I know you could always say that, well, people have always been frustrated with life. There's always been bad economies and recessions and bad job markets and difficulty with this, that, and whatever, which is true. But I do think the general trajectory of things in the 90s was still very positive. For example, I remember that there was the expectation that your kids would do better than you would. That was still very much expected back then. And also, I think one of the things that made the 90s stand out as an optimistic decade was the fall of the Soviet Union. And that pretty much set the tone for the entire decade. There was, at least from my perspective, I'm sure from the perspective of many millennials, America was a very upbeat and optimistic and forward looking place for about a decade. So, from about the fall of the Soviet Union until 9/11, things were looking up in so many ways. I mean, America emerged onto the world stage as the only superpower. The economy was good. We were just getting internet, and the internet was still a cool, wild, wild west place. It wasn't this overly corporatized small world that it is today. It was also a part of life. There were probably a few people living on the internet or spending way too much time on the internet back in 1995 or whatever, but it was not a super common thing. There wasn't really the concept generally of being chronically online. So yeah, the culture was just very different. You know, now the culture seems very cold, very closed off, very superficial, vapid, self-absorbed, and and even though there are still good out there, there's still good in the world. There's still good people. There's still people who will stop to help when someone needs it, and so on. This stuff seems a lot less common than it used to be. And I mean, I understand that because, you know, I would say now here in the 2020s, we're pretty much in a survival culture where you have so many people. I would say the majority are just paycheck to paycheck. Many can't find jobs. Young people can't afford houses, uh, can't get married and start families. The birth rates are declining. The economy and the stock market are all over the place. There's geopolitical instability constantly. And, you know, we just don't know what's going to happen next week, but we know that it's probably going to be bad. And again, I know someone could say, well, back in the 90s, you had, you know, Waco and you had Ruby Ridge and you had Oklahoma City and you had all these things. And that's true. There were individual things and there were pockets of bad things, but I'm just saying the overall picture of things was pretty optimistic and things I'm not saying things were really truly going in a good direction because I guess they weren't when you consider how things have ended up, but it looked like that. It looked like things were getting better. That was the culture and the temperament of the culture. And speaking of culture again, one thing I distinctly remember is that in the 90s there was a kid culture. It was considered a good thing to be a kid, and I to me that makes perfect sense because one of the things millennials are known for is that they had very good childhoods, but they got very disappointed in their adulthoods when everything started going downhill in the U.S. But millennials often remember a very happy, positive childhood in the 90s. And I know, again, there were kids who had bad childhoods in the 90s, no doubt. But I'm just saying, generally, it was pretty good. And I do, like I said, I do distinctly remember a kid culture. There was a lot more uh, stuff out there for kids. There were kids movies, and there were Saturday morning cartoons, and there were spaces in the culture and in society and in the economy that was just for kids. And sure, we have, of course, things for children now, but it's taken on a different form as I see it. It's got a very different feel to it. So you've got a lot of family oriented or some family oriented stuff. You know, it's a movie that the whole family can see or something like that. Which I think the general feel of it used to be that, there was this movie and it was for kids, but there were, of course, the writers would throw in something that the adults would get and be able to get a chuckle at, or something like that. But it was still meant for kids. It wasn't meant to be, I mean, obviously it was good for the whole family if the whole family wanted to watch it, but it was for, kids. It was for that demographic. And if I compare this with how things are nowadays, I would say there isn't really a kid culture. You've got basically this big internet narcissism machine, social media machine that's driving uh, kids to grow up too fast and to start. I mean, you've got middle schoolers that trash talk like they're gangsters or something. I mean, it's just bizarro world that we're living in. I know, when I was growing up, if you cursed by yourself and, say your parent overheard it or a teacher overheard it or something like that, you got in trouble. Now kids will just do this, like, just blatantly, openly, and they don't care. They just practically dare the adults to do anything about it. Uh, it's very strange, like I said, and it doesn't portend very good things for society either and where it's going. Another thing I remember is that reading was a lot more common, and kids read. And, for example, the Goosebumps books. I mean, we all grew up with those. And I mean, I remember reading books by myself for fun, a lot. It was not some rare activity. It wasn't something I had to be forced to do. Um, I enjoyed it. And I knew I had peers who enjoyed it too. Now, of course, there have always been a lot of kids, probably more kids than not, who didn't want to read, who, that wasn't really considered something that they would do or enjoy or something like that. I understand that. It's never been most kids. But it was definitely a big enough segment of the population that, like I said, you had a much bigger sector of publishing that was for kids. Whereas now, if you find, a handful of students in any given school who actually do read anything on their own that's not, Instagram post or whatever, then you're doing good. Another thing I remember fondly is that fast food restaurants were very individualized. A McDonald's looked like what a McDonald's was supposed to look like. A Burger King looked like what a Burger King was supposed to look like. A Taco Bell looked like a Taco Bell. And, I mean, with most of them, you knew what they were from a distance. You didn't just have to get up to them or see the sign and that was it. You could tell a lot of times from the building itself what it was. Especially places like, say, Pizza Hut. But yeah, fast food used to be very family oriented. It used to be much more bright and colorful and vibrant. And, I think a lot of the change in that has been because of demographics, because now there are fewer kids and fewer families. And so a place like McDonald's doesn't need to appeal to that portion of society just because there's a lot less of them. And so I think this drab gray block architecture that, fast food uses is just so that it's I guess it's the safest thing they could do. It's impossible to not appeal to anybody because it appeals to nobody. It's not made for anybody. It's not made for kids. It's not made for families. It's not made for special occasions. It's just slop in a gray box that's there anytime you want it. You can DoorDash it if you want, and it will be expensive, even though it's fast food that's not actually fast. So, fast, and I know that's probably a strange thing to talk about fast food nostalgically, but really, even something as simple as that was so much better 30 years ago, or even 20 years ago. Okay, so fast food was better, and kids read more, and things were more optimistic in general. But I'm not just suggesting that the 90s was a magical time just because it was the 90s. There were, geopolitical and global things. Like I said, the Soviet Union collapsing, made things a certain way. And there were cultural differences and differences in attitude and temperaments and things like that. So if I really had to identify what it was that made the 90s so special, I would say it was this. You had screens, but they didn't dominate life. You had screens, but you just used them sometimes. There wasn't this low grade stimulation that was constantly running in the background. Now, sure, you had a lot of parents and grandparents and whatnot who never turned off Fox News or whatever. But you could still go in the other room and get away from that, or, it would be turned off when they went to bed or whatever. If anyone did have a cell phone back then, of course, it was just for calling and maybe a very early form of texting. And so even though screens were there, they were limited and you could break away from them when you wanted to. It wasn't even hard to do. And there were video games and televisions and all that kind of stuff. But again, they were just part of life. And, sure, there were kids who tried to spend way too much time playing video games. That'll always be the case when there's something like that available to young minds. I understand that. But it was a lot easier to break away. And most of the time, if you were a normal, happy, healthy kid, you didn't stay engrossed in a screen, for 6 or 8 or 10 or 12 hours a day. You could come home from school, you could play a little Donkey Kong Country or Super Mario World or whatever, and then you'd go play outside, and it was fine. It was a very balanced way of life, especially compared to now. And although of course, you had big corporations, you had advertising firms, you had these forces that were still trying to advertise to kids and get them or get their parents to buy, toys and junk cereal and, whatever. That has been a thing for a very long time, of course. I'm not saying that stuff didn't existed, but again, it was a portion of life. It was relegated to, well, you'll see that stuff on TV commercials, and yeah, you're gonna pester your mom until she buys you the Ghostbusters Ecto Coolers or whatever, which were really good, by the way. But there were definitely limitations to how much you were going to be exposed to, and if you really needed to, you could break away from it. There were plenty of times when I was a kid where I just turned off the TV because I came home from school, I watched the show I wanted to watch at 4 o'clock or whatever. And then, around 5 o'clock, I wanted to go play outside. I wanted to go experience that part of life because that was a very important part of my life. And so I think in a lot of ways for kids, the 90s was a sweet spot between technology and imagination. You had a lot of both. They were both a big part of life. And it's just been difficult to see the human imagination be dimmed so much in the decades since then. And I would like to think that everyone still really has it deep inside them, but it is hard to imagine these days everyone getting it back. But I remember using my imagination, and you weren't just doing it to try to monetize something or try to impress people or be hyper competitive. It was what you did. It was part of being a kid. It was so normal that I don't think anyone thought you could really separate kids from imagination. So, like, for example, I remember many times when I was a kid, I would play outside, and if I got tired, I might just lay on the grass and stare up at the clouds and imagine what the clouds look like, and imagine that, oh, there, maybe there's a city on top of that big white puffy cloud, or oh, that looks like a giant elephant floating across the sky. And it all just seemed so bright and so vibrant, and just so, it was as if the atmosphere itself had some kind of undercurrent of hope to it. It's maybe just remembering childhood fondly, but But you really did have these times in your life where you could just use your imagination and you could relax and you could disengage from technology and from society, and you could just go out in the backyard and you could just play. And it really was play. And it was just play, and you weren't worried what anyone thought of it. And it was just fun. And your life would not have been so whole, so complete, if you didn't have those times when you could just play with your imagination. You picked up a sword and you picked up a stick and pretended it was a sword, and that disfigured tree out in the backyard was the evil giant that you had to slay to save the princess, or there was actually a parade of cloud animals drifting through the sky, or you were just trying to ride your bike as fast as you could and pretend that you were in a race with, you know, other kids who weren't really there and pretending that you were winning the race. I mean, there was just a lot of stuff like that that I really couldn't imagine, kids or teenagers or whatever doing these days. I mean, you just don't really see it. And there's a certain part of your mind that really cannot function if it's constantly around stimulation, if it's constantly around people, if it's constantly busy or constantly exhausted. It just won't work. You can't just turn it off and turn it on whenever you feel like it. And that was just such a crucial part of growing up in the 90s, was that you could break away and be in the world of your imagination, and you just didn't have the weight of the world bearing down on you all the time, or it didn't feel like it. And on that note, the last thing I want to bring up is that because of that, and because technology had not yet inundated all of life, there was a sense of mystery about things, and there was a sense of exploration and discovery. And you had that before the almighty algorithm took over everything in life. You might catch part of something on TV, but you caught it in the middle, so you didn't see the title screen, or you didn't know how the story started. And the only way you were going to find out what it was for maybe someone to mention it as they went to commercial break, or for it to rerun, or maybe to talk to somebody at school and say, "Hey, did you see that show? Oh yeah, yeah, that's called blah blah blah." And that's how you could find out about things. You couldn't just instantly go to the internet in your pocket and look it up and be like, "Oh, okay, that's what it was. No big deal." It's like your brain had to work harder, but that made it feel more important. It made it feel like, "Oh, I discovered something." It wasn't something fed to you. It wasn't just something given to you by an algorithm in 2.3 seconds, and then you're just like, "Oh, okay, that's what it is. Who cares?" It things could actually stick with you, and because you had to be more selective about your content. There wasn't as much on TV. There weren't as many video games released, and of course, graphics and the flashy technology part of it was not as prominent back then. So you consumed less content, and there was less available, and it a lot of it had to be better. Now, of course, the stuff made for kids is still, made for a certain level. It only, has a certain depth and everything, sure. But a lot of that stuff, a lot of us older millennials now get nostalgic for, because it did have an impact on us. When we watched a show after school, for example, it tended to be something you would think about more. It wasn't just, okay, I'm binging this, I'm binging that. You couldn't binge it the same way unless maybe there were reruns where they did like a 4 hour block or whatever. And even that was still not nearly what a binge of, say, a Netflix show is in 2026. So there was less content. You cared more about the characters and what was going on in these fictional worlds that you saw. And kind of combine that with your imagination, because as a kid you might go kind of pretend you were in your favorite TV show or your favorite cartoon when you were playing outside after you finished watching it. And so it just kind of, these things combine to make things feel more real and more meaningful and more impactful. Whereas now it's just you have unlimited content 24/7. And so even when you find something you like and something that emotionally hooks you and whatnot, it still just feels kind of blunted. Not because that thing is necessarily not that good, because it may be really good. It's just that you have so much other stuff and your brain just cannot emotionally attach to that many things. And so it's kind of like the paradox of choice, if you've ever heard of that. And the paradox of choice kind of goes like this: if you have a choice between chocolate ice cream and vanilla ice cream, you will either pick one or the other, and you'll be satisfied with your choice because there were only two choices. But when you have 47 flavors of ice cream and you pick one, you're probably going to second guess your decision at some point, or you're going to finish your ice cream and say, well, I had the chocolate ice cream, but I really should have picked the chocolate mint ice cream or whatever. And so I think just about everything's like that. The more choices you have, the more difficult it is to be content with your choice. And so when you live, as we do in algorithm world, you have unlimited choices of content, and so it always feels like, well, I didn't get the exact right piece of content that I needed that day, or you don't feel emotions as deeply because your brain has tried to sort of form these emotional thoughts and connections and feelings to things. But there was just so much stuff that it's almost like it has so much choice that it can't figure out what to attach to. And so you just kind of end up feeling numb to all the stuff all the content you consumed. And so anyway, that's probably the biggest thing. There was a sense of mystery and discovery and exploration that you can't really replicate it in 2026 unless you are intentionally not using the technology that's there. Because I mean, I don't think it would even be possible to use something like, say, Netflix. I don't use Netflix, but I mean, to use Netflix, the algorithm is going to suggest things to you, or you're going to be searching for what you want to start with initially before you flit over to 20 different shows over the weekend or whatever. And so you couldn't you there a sense of discovery is not even possible with a technology like that, I guess, because it's going to tell you and identify things for you and push things on you from the get-go. And as long as you're using it, the process continues. Netflix never gets to a point where it says, well, you've watched 17 shows this weekend, so maybe you should go outside and touch grass. Now, in theory, maybe you could try to not use your phone as much, or not even just not use your phone necessarily, but just use your phone as a phone and try not to use the internet on your phone, which, again, realistically is not going to happen. I mean, someone could intentionally do it, but it would be harder than they realized. And even if an individual does it, you're going to be, in a sense, cut off from everyone else who hasn't tried to do without it. So the thing I found that really is more workable is not to do that constantly, but just to have times of the week or times of the day where you kind of have a digital fast and you just go, 4 hours before bed without your phone or whatever. Or maybe you take, Saturday morning where you just relax if you're off from work and don't use any screen-based technology or whatever. But I guess that's a topic for another video. So anyway, thank you for listening. And if you wouldn't mind liking and sharing and subscribing, that would help me out a lot and help me keep doing this. If you like this topic and you miss things from the 90s too, please let us know in the comments. It's always a fun and nostalgic discussion. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.